Excited to be here. We've got 5 panelists. There are 4 panelists, including myself, to talk about tooling, which is always a fascinating topic. We'll start with, let's see, Mark's up at the front of the list. So Mark, come on up. So Mark Shuttleworth, who we just saw an hour ago, founder of Canonical. Come on up.
Thank you.
So Nati, CTO of GigaSpaces. Sumeet, founder and CEO of AppFormix, who was a great sponsor of the cocktails last night. Thank you very much. And then Luke, who's the founder and CEO of Puppet Labs, often a challenging combination. Perfect. All right. So tooling is one of those topics that I think is particularly fascinating because it always sort of sits in the wings. It's what we all use to deploy, operate, and scale our technologies that we're all working with, whether you're an operator or you're a user on top of a cloud. But it's one that we often fail to talk about. In particular, I think it's pretty fascinating because it's a crowded space. And we've seen over the last couple years so many new technologies enter and big rounds being raised by a lot of the companies involved in the space. Puppet has raised a ton of money, hopefully on track for IPO pretty soon. And you look at Chef, and it's impressive to see. So wanted to get this group together really to talk about some of the lessons each of these individuals has learned from their years now, I think collective years of working in this space. So I think as we related to OpenStack, so much of the conversation historically has been around installation of OpenStack. And you look, we see demos with Landscape, like those are really, they're slick examples of what you can do with automation. But some would argue, and I argue this point all the time, that installation is sort of the solved problem. That there's much bigger challenges with OpenStack beyond just getting it up and running. So wanted to kick it off with an agree or disagree with that comment.
That it's about operations.
It's about operations.
Absolutely agree, yeah. That's the choke point on OpenStack for most people in production. Yeah.
I would say given the number of installations out there in the world, it would be incorrect to say that installation is a solved problem. That doesn't mean that it's the bigger problem. I think the point you're making of operations being the real problem because ongoing maintenance and management of the system is way more important than installation in the first place. But actually getting it installed the first time is also, it's a barrier. And it's still, I would say, a pretty large barrier to the majority of the market. So I wouldn't downplay installation, but I would say it's less important than ongoing management.
So what do you think is the biggest cause of that barrier?
OpenStack is the most complicated piece of software that any average organization will ever have installed. That's probably the average barrier.
And so, but we're five years in now, and there are umpteen number of ways to do that installation, some open source, some proprietary. An organization can certainly pay a vendor to do the installation, can often take some of the open source tools and do it on their own. Do you think that the challenge is choosing where
Again,
to go?
I don't mean to say that installation is the problem you should focus on. Operations is absolutely the problem you should focus on. You just shouldn't assume installation is a solved problem.
Yeah, I would add to that I would actually refer to Randy Bass' comment yesterday. It is an unsolved problem because it is very complex, and we could see even the installer themselves of OpenStack being changed from Puppet, now Ansible in HP, and HP used SaltStack before, and you could see the installation themselves changing a lot of the tools themselves year after year to understand that it's not going to be solved. And I think the only solution that we're seeing working in that, given that it's going to continue to change, is the appliance model, the hosted model. That's really, I think, the direction that I think most people don't really like, but probably the only way to solve that problem. And that's why we're still stuck in that point. There are too many options. There's going to be a lot of options, and installer would never solve that.
So I'm delighted to say that I couldn't disagree more. Here's a useful analogy for you, which is to think about phase changes of matter, right? Think about H2O. We're all familiar with H2O, right? But the way you would deal with moving a ton of ice across town is completely different to the way you would think of moving a ton of liquid water, and completely different to the way you'd think of moving a ton of steam, right? It's the same stuff. And I think the biggest mistake that people make when they're talking about tools is they assume that they don't understand that we're in that throughout history of technology, we've gone through a series of phase changes. And the appropriate tools are completely different in a different phase. So to the point that was made about OpenStack being the biggest and most complicated piece of software any institution will ever deploy, I think that's exactly wrong. I think it's just the first obvious example of the new phase of software that we're in. All the interesting software that I see, all the interesting software, open source or otherwise, is distributed, complex, multi-service, right? We've taken what used to be a complex binary and split it out so that you're actually deploying the guts of the thing. It's as if you were deploying all the parts of the Oracle database on 50 different machines at different times on different life cycles, right? That's just the new face of software, right? It's a phase change. And so we've gone from an era where you could sit down at a machine and deploy software and configure it. And maybe there were tools that allowed you to think about machine and configuration files were appropriate, right? But in a different phase, you need a different set of tools. And I think tools that speak to the modeling of services and intrinsic scale, understand that scale is part of the equation, make it a lot easier and a lot more tractable, not just to deploy the software in the first place, but then to operate it. So that's what's exciting about these new model-driven systems, is they essentially say encapsulate, model, and stand back, right?
And I think one of the interesting pieces, and this came up yesterday in some of the keynotes, was this correlation between Linux and Linux as its set of distributions and how complicated Linux was, and OpenStack and its complicated nature today. And I made a comment on Twitter yesterday that the reality is with Linux in a single system, your blast radius of failure is often a single system. And with OpenStack or any of these distributed systems, which is exactly what we're seeing, your blast radius now can be your entire production installation. And so the challenges we experience in failure and the challenges that we experience when things with tooling or monitoring or operations don't go right are so much more impactful on our businesses today that it is a brand new era.
So I think the other thing that people don't pick up on is the idea that the knowledge and tools are inextricably tied together, right? So if you think about the use of a tool, you've got to ask the question, where's the knowledge coming from to use this tool appropriately? So for example, if I'm gonna spin up a big Hadoop cluster, you've got to ask the question, does the guy who's using the tool to do that know everything that he needs to know about the result that he wants to get? And so with your traditional config-oriented tools, it's very clear. The guy who is writing the script effectively has to know all the details of that software because he's got to know the result that he wants there. And that gives you a certain kind of result. That person's going to get exactly what they want, but you have to hire somebody who knows exactly what they want. And one of our views is that as we go through this phase change of software, it's going to get harder and harder to find the unicorns who know everything about everything, right? That used to be quite easy.
I think that's really reflects the main differences, I think, in views. Most people don't want to know about those knobs. They want to configure those knobs, don't need to know them, and the value of actually playing with those knobs is diminishing.
Right, they like the SaaS experience.
They like the SaaS experience. Most users are in that space. I mean, there are users that are operators that needs to run the cloud, and there are users that wants to consume the cloud. For them, spending weeks on installing software they cannot even maintain afterwards. And I had a podcast, interestingly enough, on the state of OpenStack for enterprises, and you could see all the list of challenges that enterprises need to deal with. The conclusion that you come up, I don't even know an enterprise that actually have the skill set to run something like that.
Right, and surprise, they fail when they try.
Exactly,
right?
That's why I'm saying that at some point you need to outsource that problem completely because you cannot expect all the industry to build that skill set. And that's why,
that's the thing. Outsourcing isn't the solution either because the person you outsource to needs the tools as well. Having the right tooling is what the solution is, right? We have Puppet, we have Chef, we have Ansible. We have so many different ways to now deploy. I don't think deployment is a hard problem. I completely agree with Mark. I think deployment is a solved problem. If we choose to do things the wrong way, it's our fault, right? I mean, solutions are available. Where the challenge is the blast radius, as we've been saying. It's a very large distributed system. Distributed systems are complex. They're not easy, right? We need the tooling to know when things are going wrong. right? We need the tooling in place to be able to see what's really happening with this large infrastructure, and that does not exist.
But that
Yes,
gets
that's
me to
the
point.
monitoring piece. So we've looked often at configuration management, and that's always generally stood alone from monitoring,
Yeah.
from
Since the very first days of Puppet, one of the first things people do with Puppet is deploy a service, deploy the monitoring that goes with the service. So it's separate from monitoring in the sense that it's not the same tooling, but it's never been separate in the sense that you always want to be able to say, I can, when I put out a service, I can guarantee I'm going to monitor it, and I can audit it, and I can secure it, and all those things. And then when I remove a service, I can guarantee you're not going to have any, incorrect red lights because you meant to turn the service off, and now you didn't turn monitoring off. So I wouldn't say that they're separate. In general, practice is always using the same. They are separate frameworks, but I think that gets back to Mark's point of you're beginning to disassemble these services, and I think it works there.
But that only works if you have the tool to monitor, right? If you don't have the tool to monitor your OpenStack infrastructure that gives you that red or green light, then how does that process work?
Yeah, let's talk about the green and red light. I mean, I use the auto trading analogy. How many trades do you think today are done by human traders that are watching red and green screens and push a button?
Let me
I can
change
tell
that
you that
question.
80%
How
of the
many
trades.
bad trades are done by human operators?
Well,
how many times do they get
Let's not
fat
get to
fingered?
that route because I'm not probably the
Traditionally,
best
all of them.
person to ask that question, especially not now. I'll tell you that story afterwards. But in generally, I think that when we focus about monitoring, we think about screen, green lights, red lights, all those type of things that most human operators don't know what to do without information. So even if they will see the flashy screen with a lot of numbers on it, they wouldn't know what to do with that. So I think the missing piece here is two things, especially in the DevOps world. One is how do we integrate monitoring with the DevOps tools because it's going to change. So we need an API-driven monitoring, if you like. Second, we don't need human in that process to pass that information. How do we loop that information so that a robot can actually understand it and act upon it for auto-scaling, for self-healing, for all those type of things that could be completely automated. And that's why I think that the flashy screen is not where we need to focus.
Yeah, and the way I put it is it's like the driverless car, right? Today, we all drive cars. We are analyzing all those, the signs around us, the signals, how fast we are going, how slow we are going. It's us as the human operator who's operating. We need to get to that driverless car, right? Everything is analyzed automatically,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? This car runs on its own. We're just passengers in it. That's where we need to take the cloud, right?
So I want to pivot. So yesterday, Randy's talking about differentiation in OpenStack, and how does a vendor actually make their software better than competitors. In the tooling space, we've got a little bit of a different story because there is proprietary code, or even if it's open source, it is unique code between each offering. How do each of you think about the market and how you differentiate and how do you monetize your offering?
I mean, for us, our differentiation is the fact we're model-driven, the fact that it's try to find the right balance between simplicity and power. We want to be just simple enough that nearly everybody can use it, and just powerful enough that it can be used to solve nearly every problem. We're still for sysadmins. We don't claim to be for developers. We don't claim to be the best development framework or tooling or language in the world. The power you get from the modeling, the power you get from the fact that you can do analysis at every stage in the pipeline. You can do, so we're doing some significant changes to the language right now. And as we do that, because we're not using Ruby, because we're not using a native language, we have a ton of ability to do basically static analysis. We're not doing analysis of a Turing-complete language, which is very, very hard. We're doing analysis of a dramatically simpler language that we wrote the parser for. And then beyond that, you get security and auditability benefits that are massively greater in the platform overall. That results in us having hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of data on any given infrastructure at any time. So that's a big part of our differentiator in general.
And I would say that I think that the open source model, I think, becomes the standard if it wasn't before. OpenStack definitely pushes the limit to all companies, including DMC and VMware. The last, if you like, dinosaurs in that space that wasn't open source to be open source. So that's, I think, drives also the business model monetization model, which is if you're open source, then when you're getting closer to production, as Adrian mentioned, then you pay for support, but not for evaluation and not for the initial phases where you don't really get value. So open source, by definition, gets you to the point where you pay when you get value and you don't pay when you don't get value or when you're doing basic things. On top of that, I think there is other added value services, added value components that people add, whether it's Juju in the case of Ubuntu and our monitoring tools, for example, in the case of Cloudify. Those are other areas of monetization. The important thing is to keep it to the point in which everyone that uses the open source tools that you provide can build those tools also himself fairly easily, and not to create features that will break or make the open source product crippled in one way or the other. So it's mostly by adding values and by support, which is another way to add value.
So in the case of Canonical, obviously, our interest is to enable people to go faster. If you're going faster on the cloud with Juju or with Puppet or with Chef, doesn't matter what the tool is, then that's good for us. It's even better if you're doing it on-prem, because on-prem people tend to want the support engagement that we would provide around the platform. So in fact, our sole interest in tooling is just to help the people go faster and to go faster as we move into this new phase of software. So we don't monetize things like Juju independently of the platform. If they help people consume the cloud faster, then that's almost certainly good for us. There's no enterprise edition. It's kind of all enterprise, and it's all open source. There's some really interesting points about monitoring. First, I'd say you've got to separate out monitoring of machines and stuff like that, where people will always have their own choice of tools, and your configuration tooling, et cetera, that should just enable people to deploy what they want, right? Because you're never going to convince them to do something different. But if you think about the app itself, again, it comes down to this question of where's the knowledge, right? Do you have to hire somebody who knows an app, even if it's open source, in enough detail to put in all the probes to tell you exactly what you want, as Nati said, to get you the green light? And I would say that, no, you don't want to do that. That you really want to be disciplined about saying, look, I want to consume the software on-prem. I don't want to outsource. And I don't want to throw all my data out into the cloud in SaaS. I want to lose control of the data, because that's lock-in, right? What I want is I want to be able to let the software run the software. I think the key piece of this is open source, right? If you've got open source software operating open source software, then you can assume that there's a community-driven process around quality and capabilities in there. And if that framework includes the ability to give you a monitoring view of that application that you're automatically deploying, well, then you're in the pound seats, right? Because now you have a best practice, an encapsulated best practice story.
Aren't you then outsourcing that? Somebody has to know how to run the stupid software somewhere. And if you're saying that open source solves the problem, then what you're saying is random people somewhere on the internet know how to operate my software.
I think Mark is saying something different, actually. I interpreted that as something else, as in, if you have the APIs, then perhaps the applications are better tools themselves to operate.
Well, what I'm saying is that business value moves, right? So especially for smaller businesses, they're very focused on deciding what's their core competence, right? It's very unlikely that your core competence is OpenStack. It's very possible that your core competence is some app that you write on top of OpenStack. So where should you be investing? Consider Linux as well, right? I know full well, I'm delighted at how many people get value out of Ubuntu without knowing a damn thing about how it works, right? And so to your point, Luke, I think it is really important that you absolutely know the stuff that is your business. I think it's really important that you can consume as a commodity as cheaply as possible a best practice version of everything else. And if that's open source, that operates itself, runs on your premises so that you don't lose control of the data, and just works, then I think it's a winner. So that's why we're so focused on Juju, right?
Yeah, that ties in Adrian's point about differentiation as a service and delivery of open source software as a service, and that being where markets are made. But we're out of time. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Super interesting.